Hi, my name is Katelyn Meehan, and I am a director on PHN's board. I am very excited as we have an esteemed panel today to discuss some emerging financing vehicles for making energy efficiency pay. Today we have Rob Harmon with MEETS, Matt Golden with Recurve, and Steve Fawkes with Energy Pro. Since the panelists know their programs better than I do, I will let them further introduce themselves.
Hi, folks. I'm Rob Harmon. I run the MEETS Accelerator Coalition. We are working on long-term efficiency agreements to help enable both a better new construction and retrofits of existing structures. And I'm going to talk for about 7 minutes about what's happening in Seattle around this, directly related to Passive House. So I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So I'll just hop right into this. The idea of MEETS, which is the metered energy efficiency transaction structure, when it comes to new construction, especially multifamily construction, is to make Passive House and things like Passive House the new normal, deeply energy efficient buildings. And I'm going to show you how that's working in Seattle. So this is a 50,000 square foot multifamily Passive House building on 24th Avenue in Seattle. Give you a few details about that building. It's, as I said, 50,000 square feet. Its EUI is about 20. Seattle has a relatively strict new code for buildings. It's actually getting stricter as we go. That code is 36. So the building's about 44% better than code. The cost to attain those improvements on the energy side are approximately $250,000. And there was an upfront utility incentive available for about $50,000. I'm sure many of you experienced this situation. So that leaves about $200,000 of above market costs uncovered for the developer. It's about $4 a square foot. So in this building, the tenants pay the energy bills. So you have what we call a split incentive of about $200,000, where the investor is expected to provide that $200,000, and the result is lower bills for the tenants normally. So, of course, what that does is to force above market rents to cover that $200,000 split incentive. So we have a program in Seattle. Seattle runs a program called Energy Efficiency as a Service, which is modeled on MEETS, and I'm going to show you how that works. This is a slightly more elaborate slide than we use on the Passive House buildings, but I'm going to show it to you. So imagine that's that building. There's a phrase used in MEETS called an energy tenant. This is often used on a retrofit project. In this situation, the building owner is going to play this role of the energy tenant. They're essentially the party that's responsible for making the building more efficient and keeping it more efficient. So they receive money from the investor, in this case, that additional $200,000 to make $250,000 to make the building more efficient. They would ordinarily pay rent if they were a third party, but the building owner is taking on this role. So the building owner and the tenants have a more comfortable and valuable building based on that investment. What the utility does is it meters the efficiency against a dynamic baseline. In this case, it's a code baseline. And so they're metering the difference between what a code building would do at that higher EUI and what this building actually does. So they meter that efficiency and they pay for it over a long-term contract. So in this case, that's 20 years. They then take that metered efficiency and they put it on the building owner's energy bill in the same way they put utility energy from the grid on the energy bill. So the building gets a bill for 2 meters. It gets a bill for the grid delivered energy, and it gets a bill for the building delivered efficiency. So that essentially in the end, the building is paying a code energy bill. And that's what pays the investor back for the investments they've made. So for the tenants in this building, they're going to have this very highly productive, high-performing Passive House building, and all they're going to need to do is to pay the same share of the energy bills that they would ordinarily pay. The developer in this building, Sloan Ritchie with Cascade Built, is using ratio utility billing services, RUBS, for that. And we have some information on that. You can contact me after the presentation if you want more information on that, if you don't already know about it. So the result of that, there's a 20-year agreement with the city utility, Seattle City Light, to buy that meter deficiency. There are no upfront incentives paid, so that $50,000 upfront incentive is foregone. The total cash flow from that 20-year agreement is $560,000. The net present value of that, so basically you're dealing with the cost of debt there, is about $300,000. So there's $300,000 more available because of the presence of this agreement when this building is being built. So that's about $6 a square foot. As I mentioned earlier, you have a cost to attain those energy improvements of about $250,000. So that's about $5 a square foot. So under this energy efficiency as a service meets approach, what you've done is to more than cover the above market cost from the energy improvements and create a better return for investors in the process. So that's the way it works in Seattle, and we're looking to do that other places. So that's what I have. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Rob. I think I'll just jump right in. My name is Matt Golden. I'm CEO of Recurve Analytics. We work with utilities and also a whole range of companies we loosely call aggregators. These are various companies, folks doing everything from lighting and HVAC retrofits to whole building, deep, storage and energy retrofits, EV charging. It's really all distributed resources behind the meter. And the building, this business was actually born out of an earlier version of Recurve, retrofitting buildings, doing deep retrofits, working directly with customers. But we're very much focused not on that customer transaction, though that is the key, obviously, to scale, is getting customers to say yes, but focusing instead on making a market for the value being created by retrofitting buildings to the grid, by being able to quantify the energy capacity, greenhouse gas, transmission and distribution values when buildings are participants in decarbonization that don't accrue to the customer. Right, most of those values accrue to some utility as a counterparty, or sometimes multiple utilities. So making a market, and we think of that as a virtual power plant. Again, whether you're insulating an attic or smart controls or how you charge your vehicle, contribute to the grid. And we think individual customers shouldn't directly be paying for those benefits that are mutual in nature. So the fundamental issue that we're here to solve is the fact that decarbonization doesn't happen with kilowatt hours. The grid is much more dynamic than that. This is demand in California. We see this is called the duck curve. Many of you are probably familiar with that term, but there's a whole menagerie of various animals forming across the globe with different resource mixes, whether it's some folks have more wind, some folks have more nuclear, but the grid's a mess. And the game, if we want to decarbonize, is not just reducing demand. In fact, in many cases, we want to increase demand. And this is an example of that. So you can see in California, as we've been aggressively onboarding mostly solar, but obviously wind and other resources as well. In the middle of the day, much of the year, in fact, every month of the year, we have days like this for sure, but particularly the spring and the fall, we're over-generating solar to such a large degree that we don't know what to do with it. And we're actually paying grid scale solar, about 20% of it, to curtail, turn off, and at the same time paying other states in the US, like Arizona, for example, to take our clean solar electrons from us, paying them to take it from us. So it's very economically inefficient. And fundamentally, saving energy at 1 p.m. costs ratepayers money and does not have a carbon benefit. We're not reducing GHGs in those hours. So, we think the name of the game is aligning supply and demand. And we think that is really what energy efficiency and demand response. And we think of EE and demand response as two sides of the same coin. You can predictably load shape over a long period of time. It's kind of like installing power lines or a new power plant. You build it today, it's going to run for the next 30 years. And you can respond to market events, DR. And those are differently valuable. And we actually need to be doing both all of the time, both for the grid and for the economics to the market and the customer. So the name of the game is using more electrons when they're cheap and free and using less of them when they're dirty and expensive. And energy efficiency and net load reduction may in fact not even be our goal. As we electrify end uses and things like transportation and of course building a heat pump electrification and those sorts of things, we're definitely building load, and that's okay. In fact, that's a good thing for everybody if we can do it in those periods when we have a lot of those renewables. So load reduction, that's one thing, but load shifting is every bit as important. And so we really do need to kind of recalibrate our goals. And in places like California, there's actually no such thing as a kilowatt hour anymore in savings. All of our goals are based on something called total systems benefit. the value of load reduction to the grid in terms of when and where it happens. The kilowatt hour is out because you can do damage with energy savings, which is a new concept. So Recurve, and I'll get kind of into an example. The fundamental issue that can be a huge challenge, whether you're doing, in this case, this is an example of demand response during the 2020 blackouts. You can see this is like a 105-degree day, measuring for the CAISO the impact of a residential demand response portfolio. And again, we can do event-driven DR for the CAISO, and we can also do long-term predictable virtual power plants for the utilities at the same time. The key thing is having measurement that the market sector can rely on, and that's been a huge challenge. Procurement teams and the CAISO don't believe efficiency is real, and they're not crazy. There's a lot of reasons that's true. So having much more advanced measurement techniques that are also open, transparent to all parties. And that's a little black box, the no black box in the corner. You got to be able to put this stuff in a contract. And if you're the notion of energy efficiency is not measured, it's calculated. It's a derivative value. So the fundamentals that we provide is the ability to measure flexibility on an hourly basis, whether it's long-term or dispatchable event-driven, using methods and code that are available to all parties and standardized that increase the confidence of the buyer in whether it's the utility or an independent system operator marketplace, and also the companies that are deploying business models to solve these problems. And so I just want to make this really clear because we're kind of talking about two sides of the coin. Customers need to make buying decisions. They may choose to use manage an energy transaction structure as an example, but there are different customer-facing business models. Customers don't pay for or don't want to pay for a T&D benefit that accrues to the utility. That's no benefit to them, right? So in all cases, generally, the customer's what we want to do is allow the customer to pay for the benefits that accrue to them, lower bills, better comfort, happy tenants, and shave off and isolate the value to the grid and pay for those grid benefits through not on an individual basis, but send an actual market, grid signal to the companies out doing the work for the virtual power plants that they're providing that incorporates greenhouse gases, which don't accrue at a building level. They accrue at the stack to the utility. The T&D benefits, these things that, again, don't affect the end customer. But it does start with accurate, reliable, predictable, and transparent measurement, or you end up litigating, right? If we're going to get paid based on these calculations, everybody has to have access to them, and we have to be able to prove we follow the rules from the contract. So we deploy this with something that we call Flex Market. It's also, this is pay for performance, which is more just common parlance for it. There's some differences in Flex Market. Much of the early pay for performance work has kind of all the trimmings of a utility program, RFPs to select vendors, these sorts of things. Flex Market is much more of an open market approach. And essentially, what the utility sends, price signal to aggregators, and I'll kind of start there. And so aggregators, I'll get into a little bit more, is any company that has a business model to engage customers, to do things behind the meter that affect load shape at the meter. And we're really agnostic to, frankly, whether it's passive house retrofit or storage in the garage or insulated attics. We think we send the right price signal. The stuff that is the most valuable and works will rise to the top, but we don't have to be prescriptive about that at all. The aggregators are free in this respect to develop the customer-facing business models that the customer will actually buy. And models is the key thing with an S at the end. This is a huge market. Customers are very different. They have very different priorities, different access to capital, different time horizons, all sorts of different technologies to accomplish anything. And so we want to be totally agnostic to that and let the market compete and innovate on the different transaction structures and business models and technologies that will drive scale with all sorts of customers that are out there. And the customers are going to pay for that. They're going to pay for their comfortable building and lower bills. We're focused, and we can measure that as well, but that's not our focus. So our focus is what was the effect on demand for each of those buildings. And there's a lot of variance. So as you roll those up into a portfolio of buildings, and that's what we think of as the virtual power plant, you get a tremendous amount of stability and consistency and confidence in what the effect is. And so looking at that virtual power plant, dozens, hundreds, thousands of buildings pooled together in their location on the grid, and quantifying what is the value of that load shape impact, whether it's reductions or shifting to the grid in terms of things like T&D, capacity, energy, GHG reductions. And then the utility pays the aggregator in the middle for that virtual power plant value, aligning the incentives. So the aggregator's job is, how do I build a business model my customers will buy that also maximizes greenhouse gas and grid values? Specific things that we're rolling out right now, we're rolling out these flex markets in various forms across the country, leaning in, and it is a battle because we have this large system that was developed around utilities hiring implementers to tell everybody which measures to install. And it's very static and slow moving, and excludes a lot of innovation in the market. But in California, we have an emergency, a crisis, and crises are great opportunities, unfortunately, which is a 3.5 gigawatt, which is actually optimistic. It's between 3.5 and 4.4 gigawatt shortfall in peak energy supply starting this summer. That's what results in blackouts like that first slide I showed you. And this is a proper emergency. The governor went across all agencies and said, you got to come up with supply solutions and demand side solutions. And frankly, we're paying for natural gas power plants and paying people to run diesel generators. This is such a big problem. But at the same time, the PUC, working with other agencies, ran a proceeding and really in a very short period of time. And the solution to this problem that the PUC came up with largely was an expansion of this flex market approach, this market-driven approach, working with aggregators to the whole state, and increasing the budget from really about 7 million to about 170 million overnight. So there's a lot of activity right now and need to drive this sort of resource onto the grid quickly. And just to give you some perspective, 4.4 gigawatts was the top end. We have the largest reactor plant in California is Diablo. That's 2 Diablos of gap that we have to fill. Big. So the generic word that the PUC came up with market access, we call these flex markets. They're exactly the same statutorily. And we're focused really where the net value is on the grid, which is 4 to 9 p.m. in the summer, 8 and 9 p.m. being the most valuable hours on the grid. And that's getting later. In a couple of years, it's going to be 9 and 10 p.m. And that has everything to do with storage. That's where the greenhouse gases are, and that's where the grid benefits are. So saving hours in those particular hours in the summer, that's the vast majority of the benefit to the grid and the greenhouse gas reductions you're going to get all year long. And this is really important too. I'm going to take a sidebar here, which electrification is challenging. We're electrifying buildings and moving towards a winter morning peaking grid, and we have no idea how to get clean energy into the winter morning in California. There's some really significant challenges when you start to actually look at grid dynamics and stop using averages. Not all kilowatt hours are created the same at all. So we have this price signal, which I'll get into in a second. We're saying, and on one hand, we have the benefit to the grid that's paid based on what you deliver. And on the other hand, we have a growing network of companies, and this is actually just some of them. We're signing more up every single day. And if you look across these types of companies, we have national ESCOs, we've got companies doing EV charging, residential, solar plus storage, deep demand response, commercial lighting, grow room lighting, lots of refrigeration potential. In fact, we see potential for flexibility under every stone we turn. And potentially the largest potential is a giant existing businesses and business models that can control energy use and flex it if given a reason to do so. We've never given them a reason to do so before. So we're just fundamentally agnostic. If the customer wants to pay with cash, wants to pay with a lease or some sort of energy service agreement, that's really up to the market to sort out. And we really try to stay out of the business model, right? Whoever can get customers to do stuff that actually works, you can get paid, go. And what we're paid for is the exact cost-effective maximum value to the grid. And this market access program really is energy efficiency. And the way we define that, it's hourly valuation, like what is each hour of the year worth? But it's forecasted. It's not dispatched. We do actually layer DR on top of this. If you turn out extra savings during DR hours, you can get paid incrementally for that extra savings that you can deliver. But the reason it's efficiency is it's scheduled. We'll give you an hourly valuation for the next, for the next 40 years. And in this case, what's interesting, we're paying based on what's called a program administrator cost test. So it's the hourly savings delivered times the grid value, that roll up of GHGs, capacity, energy, T&D, et cetera, in each hour. We're paying at the end of 1 year currently. We can talk more about that, but we're paying for the net present value based on how you perform in the first year. So you get paid quarterly, but you're fully out after 1 year. We can extend that out, but there are some methodological and data-driven issues with long-term measurement. We start to drastically lose confidence, especially in commercial buildings over time, which we can quantify. But so this is getting paid out based on how you do in the first year. And then we're subtracting the cost of the program, which is much lower than a traditional program. There's a lot less rules because we've aligned the incentive structure. Now, this is the market access emergency. In many cases, we also peg this to total resource cost test, which is, if you're in the US anyways, I know this is an international audience, a more common construct that also subtracts customer benefit. This is a huge change, though, saying, why in the world why are we subtracting the cost the customer paid for an efficiency project out of the grid benefit? It doesn't really make sense. And so this is really important for things like deep retrofits, where there's a large upfront cost, and current cost effectiveness testing penalizes you for that. The more the customer invests, the less cost effective it is. But the beautiful thing here is the aggregator gets, the better they perform, the more money it's worth. So they have an incentive to do high quality work that delivers. And the utility's paying out at a cost effective level all the time. They don't have any upfront risk. Every penny they spend is cost effective. They get a rate of return. They don't have to stress out about it. And when they stress out about it, they create rules. And when they create rules, they constrict the market, make everything hard and expensive and slow. So this is an example of some of the valuation frameworks. There's a lot more to this fundamentally, but it's actually pretty straightforward. We build on top of, in California, what's called the avoided cost calculator, which is how we make all grid decisions on a long-term basis, which is what is the T&D, GHG. I'll post a link in the chat if folks are interested. They can go explore yourself. And it's been weighted more towards the peak, because, again, the real problem we're having are these orange and red hours. That's the problem on the grid right now. It's not the rest of the hours of the year. And this is just rolled up into summer and every other season. We also pay for natural gas reductions as well, based on the avoided cost value. Now, these are really steep values, because in this case, we're looking at an example of an HVAC system that has a 15-year useful life. And when you retrofit the building in the first year, we're calculating the net present value of the 15 years that HVAC system will be in place into payments in the first year. So reducing energy in these 3 hours, 4, 5, and 6, or shifting it, right, is worth $2 a kilowatt hour. And that's cheaper than the marginal cost of the alternative. It's a huge number, but the alternative is more expensive. And nearly $3 in the hours right now of 7 and 8. And you can do that by insulating an attic and reducing load or turning off lights, but you can also pre-cool your refrigeration system or your building and float through those hours. If you do that, we'll generally measure an increase on one side and catch up on the backside, but you decrease the peak hours and there's arbitrage there. And then we also pay for natural gas reductions, which, by the way, is something that is really challenging in electrification, because we vastly undervalue natural gas, the value of reducing natural gas right now, pretty much across the board. So there's some definite catch-up work that has to happen regulatorily. So we're launching a bunch of these different programs across California and soon other markets as well in the US, moving in this direction pretty rapidly. The big one being PG&E's market access program, but also working with a number of CCAs and RENs, which are regional energy networks, local government entities, and many of them focusing on different things. So the fundamental market access program is looking for least cost resource on the grid. But we have examples like 3C REN is pretty exciting, where we're focusing on electrification of residential low-income customers. And we're doing that not by just throwing money, well, there's money involved, but by increasing, in this case, the value of natural gas for low-income customers, which is fundamentally what makes electrification pencil. But it's still performance-based, which is important because these low-income programs endemically underperform. They vastly, in general, underperform the estimated values. And so by increasing the value of natural gas reduction for low-income customers, you take a market-based program focused on low-cost resource, and we layer on top of that paying for equity impact, but doing so based only on what is actually delivered to the customer at the meter, which again is really important because in electrifying buildings in California will predominantly increase customer costs and doesn't actually get GHG positive in most cases for 14 or 15 years, which is past the useful lifespan of most heat pumps because of how those heat pumps build load on the grid, creating winter morning peaking. It's not actually a GHG, does not reduce GHGs yet, because we're very far from getting to clean electrons in California. And again, I would emphasize that we have we have a goal of clean electrons on the grid in California, but we don't have a plan, and we can't just rely on that. It's highly likely that, again, if you go into a low-income customer, 75% of the time or more, their bills go up, and you don't save GHGs with that heat pump in the lifespan of that heat pump. And especially if you're adding an air conditioner, you're upside down for the life of that measure for all parties. So the last thing I'll mention, and the type of finance we're focused on, which again doesn't exclude customer finance. The customer does need to pay for their end of the deal in some form, and that's managing energy transaction structure. It could be an ESCO, a lease, it could be cash money, depends. We're focused on project finance or infrastructure financing, which is customer pays for their end of the deal, but this cash flow being created between the utility and the aggregator, that virtual power plant, that mutual benefit that doesn't accrue to the customer, like they shouldn't pay for, right? Individuals should not be using their credit or money to pay for ultimately a T&D benefit that flows to a for-profit utility. So we often mistake the word project finance in energy efficiency. We think financing an HVAC system is project finance because there's a project involved. But definitionally, it's really a form of infrastructure investing, which is fundamentally different, which is if you literally Google it on Investopedia or something, you'll find that the definition of project finance is actually financing cash flows from projects. It's how you build power plants, right? You're underwriting the value of the long-term cash flow, not the creditworthiness or the asset value of the borrower. So again, these virtual power plants and flexibility and efficiency in a portfolio work very well and are very reliable and consistent and forecastable. Individual assets vary a lot at the same time. People move in and out. Models aren't great. Models are bad, actually, in many cases. So that portfolio cash flow is very stable. So we work with aggregators to utilize data that we have to look back at their past projects and get really firm forecasts of what their load shape impact will look like and what that will be worth. And then we use companies that literally build power plants for a living to come in and finance those cash flows or sometimes insure them so that these aggregators can bring the future value of that virtual power plant forward to actually invest in the infrastructure. And again, it's two sides of the same coin. If a project's going to cost, let's say $1 million, let's say 500,000 or 600,000 of that might be a grid benefit to a utility or some utilities. We want them to pay for that piece. And so that's where the project finance comes in. And then we can take at least some of that value, because that value accrues to the aggregator, and reduce the cost to the customer. And they're going to have to pay for that piece. And that's where things like, I think, MEETs and other financing mechanisms come in. So these are two sides of the same coin. It's not one or the other. But what is important is if we want this stuff to accelerate, I don't think the right way to do it is to turn everything into a hammer and go after early adopters and make them adopt and then say, you're going to have to pay for all of it. All of these, and that's fundamentally what flips upside down the economics of these projects. Is we're asking them to do things that don't often have very great returns to the individual customer. It's over very long periods of time, when in fact we're leaving this other cash flow on the table. And so we think for all of this to stand up, we need to deliver projects customers actually want, that have bill reductions and other benefits they're likely to buy, which are, I think all of us know those other benefits are often much higher in the list of why people buy things, and fully value those grid benefits so that we're not burdening each customer with those costs that they don't really get any direct benefit out of. All right, so that's my gig. I will hand it over to Mr. Fawkes.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Thanks, Rob. So I'm Steve Fawkes. I'm the founder and managing partner of a group of companies called the EP Group. And I started the first company within the group, Energy Pro, in 2012, after a career of about 30 years in energy efficiency, energy services, and finance. And I want to talk today about changes in the finance industry rather than the energy efficiency industry. Both Rob and Matt have talked about new approaches and models for exploiting the energy efficiency potential that we're all there. But I think it's really important to put that in the context of changes and the transition that is happening within the finance industry. So I'm going to talk about some of those changes and then hopefully relate back to some of the things that both Rob and Matt have talked about. So this is the Show Me the Money presentation. And a lot of energy efficiency people and a lot of architects and passive house people are uncomfortable talking about money. I think there's often a misunderstanding, and often finance is cast as the evil people in the room. And we need to kind of get over that and increase communication between the two sides. And a lot of what we do is about kind of bridging the gap between finance people and energy efficiency people. So just to kind of put a line in the ground about the amount of money that's involved, the IEA recently said in their 2021 World Energy Outlook that getting the world on track for net zero by 2050 requires clean energy transition related investment to accelerate to around 4 trillion annually by 2030. So that's a big increase. However, they also said, and I will come back to this, there's no shortage of institutional capital willing to invest in these kind of projects and technologies. This is a little bit out of date, but I think it shows roughly where we are now. The total investment into energy systems and energy infrastructure in 2017 was about 1.8 trillion, and the energy efficiency bit in orange, somewhere around $235 billion a year. So still quite small relative to the total. And obviously what we want to do is increase the renewable piece and increase the energy efficiency piece and reduce the oil and gas and coal. And that is happening, but we need to accelerate the rate at which it's happening. So, as I said earlier, there's no shortage of capital. The total assets under management in the world is something like $103 trillion and projected to reach $145 trillion by 2025. Actually, I did a presentation a few months ago where the only unit was trillions. So I think that was a first. Interesting enough, bonds, so government bonds and corporate bonds, even now, there's something like $8 trillion that have negative yield, i.e. investors are being paid to hold them. It's pretty hard to believe, and that will go down as inflation picks up, as it is globally. But right now, there's $8 trillion lying around which have a negative yield, which is kind of surprising when you're not familiar with these kind of financial ideas. And the big transition, and this is a massive change really, is the rise of net zero and ESG investing. And we saw at COP26, financial firms that control 40% of global assets have aligned with the 1.5 degree global warming. And that's through this Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ. And then at the same time, we're seeing this massive increase in ESG, so environmental, social governance assets, which is really, as PwC said, nothing less than an all-encompassing shift in the investment landscape. And they also called it in their report the growth opportunity of the century. And, we can and we should be cynical about some of this. There is a spectrum of performance and a spectrum of commitment. And there is a degree of ESG washing, but at the same time, the asset owners are definitely pressurizing asset managers and investee companies to actually take this stuff on board and really do it. So it is a massive shift of a type that we've not seen. And the implication of that is that all financial institutions of every scale need to find pretty large scale ESG or low carbon investments. And they are all now desperate to do that. And they're desperate to do it because of this shift to ESG. And that's even now starting to change people's bonus structures, what they're being rewarded for. So they're actually looking for good ESG or low carbon investments. And it's up to us to package things up and provide those kind of investments at scale that will shift the needle on this stuff. Why are they interested in decarbonization? I mean, obviously there is the profit motive. It is a large potential market. Secondly, ESG or sustainable capital can be a lower cost of capital. If you look at green bonds over the last few years, they've been much lower cost than conventional corporate bonds. So if you can package up a portfolio of mortgages, which are defined as green, and definition is difficult, but there are moves afoot there, which I'll talk about in a minute. If you can package up a mortgage portfolio that is green and refund it with a green bond, you'll make a higher return than if you could just fund it with a conventional bond. Profit and risk go together, and risk reduction. Clearly, if we're talking about energy efficiency, as we've known for many years, if you save energy, it improves the cash flow of clients. Whether it's a business or a household, their cash flow improves if they're spending less on energy. But also, it's a risk reduction by avoiding financing stranded assets. And by that, I mean, as building regulations tighten, it becomes harder and harder to lease or buy badly performing buildings. And if you're funding those kind of buildings, you don't want them to be stranded and unsellable or unlettable. And that's particularly true in jurisdictions like the UK here and the Netherlands, where you have minimum performance standards, which are being cranked down year after year. The third big driver is the CSR, or environmental social governance drivers, that I talked about. And then, of course, finance and the financial industry responds to regulations. Ultimately, it's driven by the regulations. And those regulators are increasingly looking at climate risks. And we've had the FSB TCFD, which is the Financial Stability Board Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, led by Mark Carney, former Governor of the Bank of England. We have also the EU taxonomy, which is a system of defining what is a green investment and what is not a green investment. And all financial institutions will have to report against that taxonomy. Again, some debate about what should be in there and what should not be in there, but ultimately it's driving behavior in a big way. And, the US is not immune to this. The Fed is following this and working on its own taxonomy and its own regulators. So you've got these four big drivers on all financial institutions. I will just say a few words about the £50 note. I like to use the £50 note, which unfortunately is going to be taken out of circulation fairly soon. I believe that it's the only currency note in the world that actually celebrates energy efficiency. If you go to countries that produce oil and gas, you see lots of notes with oil rigs and gas rigs, and you see power stations on some notes. This celebrates Bolton and Watt. And James Watt invented a much more efficient steam engine, and Matthew Bolton was the entrepreneur who made it happen and scaled up into a business. And so they really created the first energy services businesses 250 years ago because they sold these steam engines on shared savings. So having looked at the problems of how to scale energy efficiency and finance, and looked at different programs and projects around the world, we've sort of come to the conclusion you need four things. You obviously need money, and that ideally is long-term project finance, the kind of finance that Matt was talking about, but also project development finance is so essential. And that's really to bridge the gap between here's an idea for a project to a bankable project. And that is inherently higher risk project, higher than risk than project finance. It typically is equity, sometimes can be grant, but it's about project development. And then you need to develop big pipelines. And I think one of the problems over many years around the energy efficiency industry is that the business models have not been very attractive. And so we do need more attractive business models that target deep decarbonization and whole system thinking. And we also need to build development and aggregation platforms that bring together lots of projects because, as we know, individual projects can be quite tiny. A few LED lamps here, a water heater there, each one is tiny. And so you do need to aggregate to be able to access institutional capital. Standardization is a huge piece, and Matt did a lot of work on that through the Investor Confidence Project, and we brought it to Europe. Standardization of the way projects are developed, standardization in technical solutions, contracts and systems and underwriting is absolutely critical. Banks and financial institutions are factories at the end of the day, and you can't build a factory without standardization. Factories are based on standardization, and banks and financial institutions require standardization. If you're just relying on one-off individual ad hoc projects developed in an ad hoc way, you'll never be able to scale it. And then building capacity. We do need to build capacity in the demand side, so end users need to understand what's available. They need to understand what they can do and how to do it. We definitely need to build capacity in the supply chain. It's particularly a big issue in home retrofit, and I think even heat pumps. Trying to get a decent heat pump installer here in the UK is very difficult. It's getting better, but so we need to build capacity, and that's the kind of areas that public money can play a role. And then we also need to build capacity in the finance industry, because all these financial institutions want to do this stuff, but they don't know what it's about. And we've done a lot of work here in Europe through the Energy Efficiency Financial Institutions Group, which helps build capacity in financial institutions. Otherwise, you talk to a financial institution about energy efficiency and they say, is that a solar panel or something like that? So you need to focus on these four pieces all at once in order to scale up. I think a couple of ideas, and again, common with Rob and Matt, really, we definitely need to think of energy efficiency much more as a resource. And, we shouldn't forget that oil and gas is a resource. And this great quote, I think, from one of the real pioneer petroleum geologists, Wallace Everett Pratt, said, where oil fields are really found is in the minds of men. If you're walking through a field, unless it's one of those rare places where oil bubbles up from the ground, you don't know there's oil there. You kind of think there might be, and you can have some technology to explore it. But it's really in the creativity and imagination to find that. And I've said many times, it's the same for energy efficiency. It's there everywhere when you look for it, and you have the ability to see it and to develop it. So I think it's really important that we start talking about energy efficiency as a resource. And when you look at oil and gas, they have this thing called the PRMS, the Petroleum Resource Management System. And it's a very well-defined way of identifying what's a resource, what's a contingent resource, and what's a reserve. And within each of those, there are different categories. People, when they talk about oil and gas, often mix up resources and reserves. But when you understand the system, it's a very precisely defined definition of resource, contingent resource, and reserves. And then there is sort of an analogy with energy efficiency. I think, there's lots of potential studies which are like prospective resources, when you think there's something there, but you haven't done too much work to identify it. Contingent resources are potential projects that you can identify in energy audits. Projects are in development when you're actually installing and designing and installing something. And then, of course, implemented projects are in production. They're sitting there producing energy efficiency, just like an oil rig is producing oil. And I think this analogy is really important because the PRMS defines value. Even if you're an oil and gas wildcatter and you have a prospective resource and you've done a little bit of geology and you kind of think there's something there, you can go and raise money on that. It will be high risk, high cost money, but you can raise money on it. If you've developed it a bit further and such that it becomes a contingent resource or a reserve, then you can raise money from a different category of investors that's cheaper money. And so these things are defined from a technical perspective, but they drive finance. And so, we should be able to raise money on the energy efficiency alternatives as well. If you want to kind of go into a building and prospect for energy efficiency, there should be some high risk money that allows you to do that. So I think that analogy is really important. And then the other kind of big idea, I think, that's now becoming more accepted and has been touched on today, really, is this whole idea of multiple benefits. I think it was the ACE or somebody did this layer cake picture a long time ago about the different benefits of energy efficiency and how they come at society level, the supply system, and the host. And as Matt was saying, a lot of projects at the host level don't actually have a great payback. But if you could bring in the benefits in the grid and the transmission and distribution benefits and have the people who benefit from that pay for it and add that to the host payment for their benefits, you'd end up with a very viable project and a much better set of cash flows. So I think finally, what do we need to scale? I think we do need to focus on energy efficiency as a resource. I think absolutely we need to focus on measurement and metering things rather than the old world of deeming savings. But we also need business models that identify and measure all of the multiple benefits that energy efficiency can produce. The kind of things that Matt was talking about on the transmission side, and I think Rob on the building side, and there's some way of bringing those things together. I think we do need to design models that meet the needs of institutional investors. And what that means is you have to give them low risk or understandable risk, which comes from the portfolio approach. But you also need to bring them scale, because institutional investors can only invest at scale. What do we mean by scale? Depends on the institution, but it's north of 100 million, probably north of 250 million, up to $1 billion. It's that kind of scale that we need to create projects at to meet the needs of institutional investors. We also need to build capacity amongst financial institutions to understand this stuff. And as I said, there's lots of good work going on here in Europe about that through EFIG and other bodies. That's important so that they don't miss the opportunity. Otherwise, there's a tendency for them to all go and put it into renewable supply type projects. And then finally, of course, you always need supportive policies. And I'm not talking about grants or programs, but I'm just talking about policies that have clear trajectories. So things like MEPS, minimum energy performance standards, which crank down the performance level of buildings year after year. Those kind of policies are incredibly helpful. And the more stable they are and the clearer the trajectory, the easier it is for institutional investors to invest. So that's what I have to say. And thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you everyone so much for the overview. I would like to ask a couple of questions, building off of Steve's final slides as it relates to scalability and the mention that there's no shortage of capital. Leaning into Rob and Matt's programs, Steve had said that there needs to be more attractive business models. And I believe that both of yours touched on a better aligned incentive structure. So I would love to hear from both or either of you of how you think that your proposed solutions are scalable and what we can do to make them more scalable.
Sure. I'll be happy to say something about that. I do completely agree with Steve that if what we lack is actually consistent deal flow and revenue grade transactable projects and data. Right, we have a lot of conjecture and not a lot of data, right? And something to remember is that models are important. We always need to forecast, but what actually matters is what happens. And so having that data set that says not just what do we forecast is about to happen, and that's important, but what is the actual delivery and what is that worth? And being able to do so with real actual, what is considered actuarial data that we can support. So if we can create these cash flows for the customer, or for the market in a way that again is reproducible, that can be verified, the money's there. In fact, it's a line out the door for the money. On the business models front, I'll just I'll let Rob talk a little bit more specifically about the MEETS model, but we just think there's a tremendous amount of innovation out there. Literally daily, we're finding new companies with ice storage cooling systems and new ways to, car charging with batteries and new IoT, this, that, and the other thing, thermal capacity for heat pumps, all sorts of innovative new things that include all sorts of really interesting financing models. We find various forms of energy service agreements, et cetera, whether it's resi, commercial, et cetera. There's lots of different interesting stuff out there. But I would also like to highlight that we don't need to create a new industry. Last I checked, the building industry is pretty big. And some of the most interesting stuff that we're finding is, we control, gigawatts of storage or of refrigeration systems. You mean we can make some money if we pre-cool them and float through peak? That would be amazing. No one's ever given it. And a lot of these companies have been getting utility KWH rebates that are incredibly annoying to them. And they basically the best companies don't play ball in these programs because there's so much overhead and transaction costs. But if we can send them a price signal and make it simple, like they like making money, it turns out. So lots of cool, innovative stuff on one hand, but like a tremendous amount of load that is under control if you can just translate the cockamamie energy efficiency, weird utility, expecting customers to care about energy when their energy bill is about that much of their cost basis and there's a split incentive and they don't even care, translating that into something that makes them money. And that's I think the big secret is that businesses will do stuff if it makes them money, and it's very hard to get them to do stuff if it doesn't. So, that's kind of our thinking there, is just aligning the incentives so that one is it's not all going to the customer either, right? Like we need really innovative businesses in the middle, investing billions of dollars to build out these business models and cushion and manage that risk. Because also, last I checked, and this I think very much plays into meats, is customers tend to want to buy cold beer, warm showers. And I don't know about all of you, but I don't pay by the minute on my cell phone. I have this thing called insurance across a lot of my life. I don't like risk. I don't think customers do either. So building that middleware that can turn the complexity and the volatility of the grid into something that's manageable to the end customer is really important. And then again, on our end, it's what we hear from these companies is just give us market access. Send us a price signal. That's the thing that they never could figure out. And responding to a utility RFP to get some deemed savings value or modeled whatever is just not in their vocabulary. And most of our utilities are vastly too small for these large companies, right? They need to address, regions of the country in the U.S., which are multiple states, not utilities, for example. So they're just not even at the table. So lots of new innovation is awesome, and we want to see that stuff scale up. And I think there's a huge opportunity of all sorts of cool stuff that isn't here yet. But capturing the existing market, we call it and getting them onboarded to where they start building business models that actually care about the grid. And we're talking to some of the largest companies out there. And frankly, we have to help their people internally make the case because they've gotten screwed so many times in this stuff. They haven't been paid. That there really is a business model worth investing in to not just sell HVAC, but to sell HVAC and be in the virtual power plant business.
I agree with all that. When I look at it, what I see is a lot of pent up demand and a lot of pent up supply, and essentially one thing in the way, which is a lack of coherent policy from enough locations. The fact of the matter is that there are very few utilities in the United States that are engaged in either one of these propositions, right? We have what I believe to be a very good idea from Matt and what I believe to be a very good idea in Meets. And there are very few places where the policy infrastructure is in place to implement either one of those things. And that's a serious problem. I think Matt's point is well taken. We don't have a technology problem. And in fact, we don't really even have a business model problem. There are plenty of business models and there are plenty of technologies out there, Passive House being one of them. And the fact of the matter is, it is simply the policy apparatus is moving too slowly. So we can't implement at scale except in very specific, relatively limited geographic regions. And that's the fundamental limitation. What we need is policymakers to step up and make these approaches scalable by getting out of the way of the innovators.
Thank you. So what would you like to see available in the future, the near future, the far future, that could help make these programs even more efficient? I know, Rob, you just touched on policy, but, also thinking about maybe in terms of scalability and equitable scalability, what are some things that you would like to see moving forward that could help accelerate this movement?
Well, just that. I think what we need is more utilities and more regulators embracing the policy innovations that are in front of us now, rather than relying on nibbling around the edges of existing policy structures. Matt could do this in a whole bunch of locations, not only all over the United States, but all over the world, if the policy were in place to let him do that. And the same is true for Meets. We could be doing Passive House in everywhere people want to build Passive House. We could do Passive House if the transaction structure were available to monetize the efficiency on the bill.
Yeah, if I can say something, I think also this, it's not so much the traditional kind of pro-energy efficiency policy that a lot of energy efficiency advocates talk about. It is much more in the area that Matt is heavily involved in, which is about regulation, the way that utilities and the electricity system and the gas system is regulated. And let's face it, it's kind of regulated in a 20th century way, if not a 19th century way in many cases. And it's just interesting here in the UK in the last few months, that sort of topic is becoming much more recognized, really, that, the existing electricity regulatory system will not be sufficient to get to where we need to get to.
And we have to engage the demand side. it's these utilities are wired, and the whole regulatory system is about building grid infrastructure to continuously grow the rate base, right? To put pipes in the ground and wires on poles, which we still, especially the wires on poles part, we still need to do. But the incentives are not aligned. They want to build infrastructure. They make a rate of return on that infrastructure. Now, we are creating cash flows that are infrastructure investments, but it requires a little bit of a shift in thinking. These utilities could get paid for investing in behind the meter infrastructure, which is, that part of every passive house project that results in T&D benefits or whatever to the grid is behind the meter infrastructure. Part of it is running the building. Part of it is like a distributed virtual power plant that we could pay for the very, very much the same way. But we really need to fundamentally shift the thinking. And just to give you a sense, like the back of the napkin is, if you look at electrification of end uses across the US roughly, and you say, we're going to, electrify buildings and transportation, we're talking about needing about 1,300 gigawatts of electrical power on the grid to cover that new load, which is 3 times what we currently have on the grid. So there is some important math that has to be done. Like electrify everything is a good mantra, but it doesn't really pencil. Like we just, we don't have enough clean energy, and like there's really no path to get there that makes any sense, especially in the key hours like 7 a.m. in the winter morning. If New York electrifies their end uses according to plan, they won't, but if they did, they would be transitioning to a winter morning peaking grid in 2034. And do the math. Like there is no strategy even to get clean electrons to the grid in sufficient amount to cover all that new heating load in the morning and the winter goes out in that time frame. There just isn't. So we have to think outside of the building too, because electrify everything doesn't necessarily have the GHG impacts we like to think we do, and goals are not reality. We miss these goals habitually, right? So we need to be thinking a little more expansively. So we think that we should be doing all things behind the meter first when it is lower cost than the marginal cost of the alternative, because it helps customers mitigate the cost of decarbonization, improve their buildings, right? And this has been a penalty actually in utility programs, helping customers. That value that people are paying for at the customer level actually comes out of the grid benefit in the cost effectiveness calculations in the US, meaning it dissuades big investments. And that's what makes passive house not pencil, by the way. Again, mostly they don't, because if you want to go deep, you've got to put a bunch of money into the building. Definitely, right? It's like retrofitting building to a passive house standard. You can do the math. I don't know. I'm a contractor. I used to retrofit building. It ain't cheap, but that's okay, right? Because the customers are getting comfort and all sorts of energy benefits, but like frankly, comfort. When I was in the business of retrofitting buildings, and I've retrofitted thousands of buildings, we sold comfort. Energy is a distant second, and GHGs really only affect a sliver of the customer base. At the end of the day, in terms of writing checks, it's icing on the cake. But anybody that says decarbonization isn't going to cost a lot, it's not true, right? It's going to cost a lot. And so, we think what we don't want to do is concentrate those costs on our early adopters. We want to mutualize those costs, but it's going to require an investment when it comes right down to it. So anyway, that's I think the thing to be pushing on is that whenever there's a flexibility resource behind the meter that we can tap, we should be doing that instead of building power plants for the very reason that it helps actual customers instead of just building more rate base that actually results in higher bills.
Who should be responsible for that investment? I mean, we've talked a lot about unlocking value, and we've talked about that there's cash flow streams, but we can't necessarily, rely on the model. So, if we have an incentive to decarbonize, to reduce greenhouse gases, and there is going to be an investment or a large amount of capital required. So, who is responsible for making that investment?
There's no way to shake it out other than we all are. Like economy-wide, we have to invest, and we should be doing that at the highest order, which means mutually, right? We should, concentrate individual value. That's the end customer saving energy on their bills, but we should mutualize mutual benefits. And so that's either frankly the tax base or the rate base. And fundamentally, it makes a lot of sense that the counterparty is the utility, because procurement budgets are orders of magnitude larger than energy efficiency budgets. And we're already going to spend the money. We have to. And so if they were going to spend $1 billion on another natural gas power plant and transmission lines, and they could spend $800 million putting in heat pumps with controls and thermal storage and not have to build that thing, well, they're the buyer. And look, societally, we just saved $200 million. That's a win. So when we look around the room, we say, who are our counterparties that should pay for this stuff? The first thing we're saying is, who already has to pay for this stuff? And this is a lower cost alternative. We should make them do it. And so that's why we're focused. We tap a lot of efficiency funding currently, but it's just a stepping stone because increasingly our counterparty is looking like the ISO, the California Independent System Operator on the wholesale side, or the power procurement teams using, and what we think energy efficiency is it's a market hedge, right? If you can reduce peak from a market and a utility standpoint, if you can reduce peaks either through long-term insulating attics or smart controls responding to an event, what you're doing is reducing exposure to the market. It's a hedging mechanism. And you're changing your long-term forecast, reduces your long-term contracts and capacity. And even if you don't have a capacity market, people are still buying long-term contracts. It's very much the same thing. So I maybe got a little bit into the weeds here, but so I guess the first thing to do is our mantra is don't be innovative. We're trying to make flexibility work like a power plant. So look around the room and say, who's buying power plants? You should buy flexibility because it's cheaper and helps ratepayers, or it helps billing owners directly. And they should be made to do it because the utilities incentive is not to really help care about their customers. They want to make money on an investment. So they're predisposed towards wires and power plants.
Yeah, and just to also add, I think it has to be institutional investors. The scale of the task is too big for the public sector, and that's the same wherever you're in the world. The public sector cannot do it. It has to be institutional investors, and those institutional investors have allocations of capital, some of which are infrastructure, and this stuff should be infrastructure. And I think along with the idea that energy efficiency is a resource, we need to promote the idea that energy efficiency is infrastructure. What that then leads to, then of course, you've got this capacity building of infrastructure investors, and we deal with a lot of infrastructure investors who are starting to realize that they have to take a bit more risk than they wanted to, that they traditionally did, because traditionally infrastructure investment is low to zero risk, but they have to put a small amount in, maybe buying a developer that then gives them a pipeline of projects, or investing in some new ideas or new technology, because that's the only thing that's going to give them the flow of infrastructure investments that they need. So that's starting to happen. It's not all infrastructure investors, but there's a natural flow towards it just to make sure they continue to have deal flow. And then the other big challenge, again, when you start talking about infrastructure, is scale, because most infrastructure investors don't get out of bed for under $250 million. It's like, oh, it's much too small. I have one friend who's an infrastructure investor whose minimum check is $7 billion or something. It's just unreal.
Yeah, and just to remind everybody, because again, I think infrastructure is investing in the cash flows from this stuff, as opposed to Steve's personal credit and the value of his house or whatever. And that just because it's not always intuitive, but these are huge numbers, and that's what infrastructure. These are pension funds we're talking about, long-term investors, right? That's where the money comes from to build power plants and the likes. And just to give you just a ballpark, super ballparky, but in California, there's 12.4 million homes. If we could electrify a house for 20 grand, which we certainly cannot, right? That's right there, right? $280 billion of consumer spending that has to occur to electrify just the houses in California. In reality, that's probably closer to $400 to $500 billion when you add the real cost of doing this stuff, which is much higher than 20 grand, and the overhead and all of that. And so and just to give you a frame of reference, we've spent about $700 million on energy efficiency programs in California across all sectors, and it's fully allocated. And the numbers are going down, not up. So we do have to ask our question, if you can't figure out where the money's going to come from to get to scale, what are we doing? And so you need a plan there. And the one thing I would just say from a passive house standpoint is I have all sorts of confidence that passive house works. I'm a builder. I know, I get it. I get the building science. I understand the models, all of that. What I'd like to see from a passive house world is that we take these models, which are of high quality relative to what's out there for sure, and we need to build a large body of actuarial data that takes those forecasts and say projects that look like this, that are forecasted like that, what really happens at the meter? What's that relationship? And that's the asset class, and that's the data set. And I know there's some of that out there. I'd love to know, but and how we measure that has to be, again, consistent. And then that's what will enable scale. But we need that in level of actuarial proof that I haven't personally seen yet.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of the banks are starting to wrestle with, especially if they've got mortgage portfolios, because they're being forced to allocate them on their level of greenness according to taxonomy. So they're starting to figure it out. But of course, there isn't easy access to that level of data. As you know, at the moment, they tend to rely on EPCs, performance certificates, which, as we know, are nonsense compared to real data. But that's starting to shift. They need that data to be able to comply with the taxonomy and comply with TCFD. So it's starting to happen.
Well, I think that's the end of our time. I wanted to thank everyone for participating today. Does anyone have any last remarks or anything they'd like to share?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.